Bueno, muy bien. Buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos. ¿Todo bien? Tenemos el gusto de tener esta actividad hoy. Ahora la voy a presentar, pero María va a dar los detalles más duros. Mi rol hoy es contarles que este tipo de actividades solemos hacerlas al menos una o dos veces por mes en el marco de lo que es la Maestría en Economía y Ciencias Políticas de ESEADE, que dirigimos junto con Aynn Rand hace alrededor de 1 año y medio acá en esta institución que ha sido tan importante para la historia del liberalismo argentino, si uno quiere ponerlo en esos términos. Maestría en Economía y Ciencias Políticas, de alguna manera buscamos formar a los políticos en economía, que es algo que les falta bastante, pero también formar a los economistas en política, ¿no? Y no solo en política. Tanto Rothbard como Mises como Hayek consideraban que un buen economista no era un economista que estuviera formado solamente en temas de economía, micro y macro, sino en temas de historia, política y filosofía. Así que precisamente sobre esto último, sobre lo que va a tratar la conferencia de hoy, donde tenemos a dos filósofos destacados del Ayn Rand Center, Ayn Rand Institute, y que hoy está trayendo el Ayn Rand Center a la Argentina. Así que desde mi lugar también agradecer al Ayn Rand Center Latinoamérica por hacer el esfuerzo de traer a personalidades destacadas internacionales al país y también habernos permitido organizar esto en ESEADE para todos ustedes. Si les interesa saber más sobre la maestría, bueno, no duden en contactarme a mí o meterse en internet porque hay un montón de información. Y bueno, le dejo en manos de María la presentación de los dos expositores y yo disfrutaré del evento como ustedes.
Gracias, Iván. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por venir. Un día a las 7 de la tarde sabemos lo que es el tráfico, así que les agradecemos mucho. Básicamente, presentarme, soy María Martí. Este año empezamos con el Ayn Rand Center para Latinoamérica, con el objetivo de promover las ideas de Ayn Rand en América Latina. ¿Por qué? Porque pensamos que las situaciones que vivimos a nivel económico y político tienen una raíz filosófica y que mientras no ataquemos ese problema filosófico vamos a seguir dando vueltas como un círculo vicioso sobre los mismos temas y los mismos problemas. Así que solamente yendo a la raíz de la cuestión, y que la raíz es filosófica, no vamos a poder cambiar Latinoamérica hacia el lado que nosotros queremos que vaya, que es hacia la libertad y el respeto por los derechos individuales. Así que como parte de las actividades de este año, estamos haciendo un tour por la Latinoamérica y dentro de ese tour tenemos la charla que nos invitó acá Iván a dar a ESEADE. Muchísimas gracias, Iván. Y sin dar más vueltas, les quiero presentar a los dos filósofos que nos acompañan hoy, que son Onkar Ghate y Ben Beyer. Onkar Ghate es director de filosofía y senior fellow del Ayn Rand Institute, es especialista en objetivismo y se desempeña como instructor y editor senior. Ha enseñado filosofía durante más de 10 años en el Objectivist Academic Center del Instituto, que es un curso online de filosofía de 3 años que a quienes les interese meterse en filosofía profunda se lo súper recomiendo. Y es autor y colaborador de varios libros sobre las obras de ficción y filosofía de Ayn Rand. Es canadiense y estudió Economía y Filosofía en la Universidad de Toronto y recibió su doctorado de Filosofía en la Universidad de Calgary. Y Ben Beyer es instructor y fellow del Ayn Rand Institute. Fue profesor asistente en Loyola University en New Orleans y el doctor Beyer recibió su PhD en Filosofía en la Universidad de Illinois Urbana-Champaign. También completó el programa de cursos en el Objectivist Graduate Center del Ayn Rand Institute, que es un precursor del Objectivist Academic Center. Por favor, le damos una bienvenida.
So I'm going to start off. I'm going to try not to speak too long. So who here is not familiar or has at least some familiarity with Ayn Rand? Is there anyone who's completely new? Okay. So let me say just a few words about who Ayn Rand was, but feel free for the new people to ask all kinds of questions about her. We don't have to stick to the topic. I'm going to be talking about her view of capitalism, but we certainly don't have to stick to that topic in the discussion. But she was a novelist and a philosopher. She's the author of We the Living, Anthem, and then the two novels for which she's most well known is The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which is there. And so she came from Soviet Russia and came to America because in Soviet Russia she actually fell in love with America and with what America, its ideals, what those ideals represented, what America stood for. America is essentially an idea that is contained in the Declaration of Independence, which lays out a new vision for what government should look like and a government for a free people. And she found that enormously inspiring. When she came to America, she was surprised by how, let me put it this way, the intellectual and political climate in America. So she came when she came in 29?
26.
26. So late 20s and into the 30s. She was surprised how anti-individual and anti-capitalism the political and intellectual climate was in the United States. And one of her missions, so this is what I want to talk about a little bit, but it's certainly not the whole of her mission, but one of her missions was to try to revive capitalism in America. So she became a staunch and uncompromising advocate of capitalism in America. And at a time when I think it's pretty much true to say that everyone was scared to even use the term capitalism. And she's trying to revive the term, the idea, and the American form of government that it represented. So she does not think of capitalism just as an economic system. She thinks of it as a political, social, economic system. And that this is important to understanding where capitalism came from. And she has a book, what do we have up? She has a book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And when she's writing, oh yeah, it's standing up, which is good, yeah. And it's a book that is about what capitalism is, and she thinks it has never been fully understood, what it is and why it's an ideal. It's an ideal social political system. The root, so now let me talk a little bit about her how she thinks about capitalism. So she thinks of it as it's a social system, a social political system that did not exist until the 18th and 19th and really into the 19th century. And that it comes closest to, you get a full expression of capitalism. She thinks the world has never seen full capitalism. And part of capitalism, the unknown ideal, part of what the unknown means is the world has never seen the full implementation of the capitalist social system. The closest it's been is in the late 19th century in the United States of America. So she thinks of it, this is a radically new idea in the history of thought, and it's a radically new political development. And one of the ways to get what is radically new here, there has always been in philosophy and in politics, I'm just going to put it in political philosophy, a question that has been impossible to answer. So there's basically two alternatives, as it will be put. You can have a view that might makes right. So whoever seizes the power of government gets to dictate all the rules, all the conditions, and all the laws that people have to live by. And why do they get to? Because they're the most powerful. This is the idea that whatever the mighty do and say, because they're the people who hold power, their say should rule. And it's been thought, at least since ancient Greece, that there's something really wrong with the idea that might makes right. The idea of what's right or what's just should rule, not just the simple fact that you have the biggest gun, so you get to make all the decisions and you make the laws. So there has been, at least since Plato's Republic, a view that you need to subordinate might, the power of the gun, the power of the state, the power of the government, to what's right and to what's just. But the question is, how do you do that? And the forms of government, including certainly Plato's view of the state and of government, is that the government should become the enforcer of what is true and what is good. It should become the institution and the organization that spreads justice. And that essentially means that it dictates what's true and what's false, and so what ideas the people who are subject to that government can hold, what are acceptable ideas and what are unacceptable ideas, and the goals that the citizens should have to pursue. They should be doing what's good. They should be pursuing true values, and the government will become the enforcer of that. So even though what they're trying to subordinate might to right, the government becomes the organization or institution that is trying to spread the right ideas and the right values. And you can think of, and certainly in the history of Europe, from which this idea of capitalism eventually comes, they have century after century after century of religious rule. And the religious rulers are enforcing doctrine. You have to be a Catholic. If you're a Protestant, you're a heretic. You have the wrong ideas. Change your ideas, or else we're going to start persecuting you, torturing you, and so until you change your ideas. So it was the enforcer of ideas, and it was the enforcer of values. You need to do what the right thing to do is. And the kind of control that together the church and the state had was minute control over people's lives, what industry you can belong to and not. So both in the realm of ideas and in the realm of action and the pursuit of values, which in the end becomes economics, the state has to have total power, because what we should be doing is having the right ideas and the right values. So you have a view that there's something wrong with the idea that might makes right. But they could never figure out, how do you really subordinate might to right in a way that the translation's not just a state that has total power, that it's just a dictatorship, that in practice it's indistinguishable from when some war, your country's been involved in some war, you lost, and now the ruling power comes in and just imposes all of what it wants to impose. So there had always been this view that the state has to hold total power. And capitalism is the form of a social political system in which the state no longer holds total power. It is a state which is radically delimited in the powers that it holds. And the basic idea that makes that possible, so that when you look at, whether you look at Britain in the 19th century or the United States government in the 19th century, or many in continental Europe in the 19th century, the power that the government had was really small compared to history and compare it to the present. I mean, in 19th century, in 19th century America, Europeans coming into America, they used to complain that in parts of Europe, they have to have papers and passports to show government officials and so on. And you should just be able to come into a country and go where you want and trade with whom you want. So, and America was much more like this. So the massive, to take one very small example, the massive passport control. We all have to carry around passports, and I came into Argentina, show my identifications. And so that, in the 19th century, governments don't have that level of power. So you get in with the rise of capitalism, a highly delimited state. That is, it has very little power. It has specific powers, but it's not a total state that can, and certainly can't command that we can enforce ideas and we can enforce the values that people should be pursuing. And the essential idea that makes this possible is the way that it would be put in the 17th, 18th centuries, is the doctrine of the rights of man, which Ayn Rand calls then, it's the issue of individual rights. This is the principle by which you properly subordinate might to right. It's the principle by which you have a just social system where the government doesn't have the power to tell people these are the ideas you have to believe, or these are the values and goals that you have to pursue. And the idea of individual rights, where it comes from is, it comes from a deep history in the Enlightenment, where they start to realize, and realize more and more as the Enlightenment progresses, that you can neither, if you want a person to actually hold the truth, and if you want a person to actually grasp what is valuable for him, what is in his self-interest, what would make his pursuit of happiness possible, you can't achieve this by the gun of a government. That a government can enforce certain dogmas. It can enforce Catholicism and say every Protestant is heretic. That doesn't convince any Protestant that his view in religion is wrong and Catholicism is right. Or to fast forward into the 20th century, you can enforce at the point of the gun that Marx and Lenin and all their dogmas, or you can put it a little differently, all their philosophies are true. And we're going to make you study this, and we're not going to allow you to read anything else. So we're going to enforce this at the point of the gun. It doesn't convince anybody that these things are true. This is not, in order to reach truths, you actually have to go through the process. You have to go through the thinking, you have to look at the evidence, you have to look at the facts, and you have to make a judgment. Like, does this follow in logic that this is actually true or not? And if you don't find that, look, the evidence is not convincing, the facts are not convincing, the arguments are not convincing, no gun can change your mind. The gun can make you act, it can make you spout the dogmas, they can make you recite and make every school child recite these things. It doesn't make them think that they are true. And part of when you read about the collapse of communism, I mean, part of it is nobody believed in it. There was no reason to believe in it. The arguments are bad. There's no evidence or facts supporting it. They tried through massive propaganda efforts to make people accept these ideas, but you can't make people accept things if you don't offer, that is, you can't make them genuinely see that these things are true if you don't offer them evidence, arguments, and so on, and allow them to make up their own mind. And this was the essential argument for freedom in the Enlightenment, that you need the freedom to think, and that a government can't have the power to enforce any kinds of ideas, any kinds of dogmas, any kinds of propaganda, religious or otherwise. It's part of why you get separation of church and state in the Enlightenment period, and it becomes a foundational principle of the American system of government. The government is not in the job, and it cannot, if it's a good government, cannot be in the job of enforcing ideas. Now, something is similar in regard to the pursuit of values or the pursuit of what's good. It was less fully grasped in the Enlightenment, and this is one of the things that Ayn Rand thinks made capitalism vulnerable, and it's one of the things that she really insists on. And so her view of what capitalism is and how to defend it is that in the pursuit of what is truly good, of what is valuable, of what is in your self-interest and what contributes to your happiness, you have to figure that out. You have to carefully think about what is in my self-interest, what will contribute to my happiness. It is I'll put it a little controversially. It's manifestly not true that to do whatever you want contributes to your self-interest or to your happiness. The mere fact that you want something does not show that it's in your self-interest. It does not show it contributes to your happiness. It does not show that it advances your life any more than the fact that any more than if you were talking about your physical health. You wouldn't say, oh, if all you're interested in is your own physical health, do whatever you feel like doing. Eat any food you want, pop any pill you want, and the mere fact that you want it shows that it's in your interest and it will advance your physical health. That's not true. Nobody thinks that. And you shouldn't think that when you're thinking of your overall interest, including that you're trying to achieve a life of happiness. So that this requires an enormous amount of thinking. And that people then therefore have to be free to engage in that thinking. And you can know any more than I can make you accept Einstein's theories, E equals mc squared. Believe it. That doesn't produce any understanding in your mind. Similarly, a government saying, stop smoking or exercise, eat broccoli 3 times a day, doesn't make it a value for you unless you really see, yeah, there is reason to do this. I should be doing this. This is in my self-interest, and I'm going to pursue it because I see that it's in my self-interest. So the view that's emerging in the Enlightenment, but is never perfected, and one of Ayn Rand's projects is to try to perfect this, is that the government can neither be an enforcer of ideas nor an enforcer of values. And the conception of individual rights is then to say, look, it's true that the government's concerned about justice. It's concerned about right and wrong. There's something deeply right about that. If we're going to subordinate might to right, you're subordinating it to what is right or to what is good or to what is just. But that doesn't translate into the government then deciding these are the ideas you have to hold or these are the values you have to hold. What a government does is it establishes social conditions and rules, or to put it a little differently, laws that make it possible for the person who wants to think for himself and figure out what is true, he has the freedom to be able to do that. And for the person who wants to think about his happiness and then pursue what is truly in his self-interest or in his happiness, he has the freedom to do that. So the government is concerned about justice, but what it's concerned about and only concerned about is establishing the conditions under which a person, if he so chooses, can pursue knowledge or truth and can pursue values or what's good. And this is what the principle of individual rights meant, or putting it in more Enlightenment terms, the rights of man. And it's why they champion, what are these rights? You have a right to life, which means you have a right to engage in the actions. So it's not a guarantee that you're going to succeed. It's not a guarantee or a promise you're going to have health care or an education or social security or a comfortable retirement. They're just about freedom of action, because all it's doing is protecting the conditions under which, if you want to pursue what's true, you're able to do that. So you have freedom of thought. You have freedom of speech. You have freedom of association. You can go talk to people you want to talk to, and it doesn't matter if they're Protestant or Catholic, doesn't matter if they're atheist. You can associate with whom you want, discuss the ideas that you want, and talk openly about them. So freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. These are all things that they're really battling for in the Enlightenment, because these are conditions that you need if you're interested in pursuing the truth. And they knew full well there's many people who aren't interested in pursuing the truth, but they're creating a system for the person who genuinely wants to pursue the truth. You have the freedom to do that because you have these rights that government is subordinate to. Government exists to establish and secure and protect these rights. So it has a job that it's protecting people's freedom of thought, it's protecting people's freedom of speech, it's protecting people's freedom of assembly, but then people have to make use of those freedoms to achieve what they're trying to achieve. And similarly, so that's in regard to the more intellectual realm. In the realm of pursuing values, what it said is, what the right to property is, again, what it is the right to action. It's, you have the right to go out and create new things, invent new things, produce, go farm, go mine, fish in the sea, set up a transportation from continent to continent, build a railroad, build a steamboat. And to the extent that you engage in that action, you get to keep the product of it. You get to keep what you've produced. The right to property was the right to keep whatever it is that you actually produce. It's not a guarantee you're going to produce anything. And if you're lazy and just sit around all the time and do nothing, you won't have any property. So the right to property was not a guarantee to any kind of outcome. It was, this is a freedom of action. This is what we need to protect. So what happened, what capitalism is, it deprives the government of having any goal of its own. The government exists just to protect individual citizens' rights. It's the individuals who have goals. I'm interested in becoming an architect or an engineer. I'm interested in studying physics or chemistry. I'm interested in building a bank or a steamboat. That, I get to do that. The government has no goals or interests of its own. And that so severely delimits the government's job. And if you think of the government and all the power that it has now, one of the essential reasons it has so much power is that people think, no, the government has goals of its own. So in an individualist system, the government is just the servant of the individual. It exists to protect and secure his rights. That's it. In every other system Ayn Rand always calls these systems, in the end, collectivist systems, the government has goals of its own to which the individuals are subordinate. And it doesn't matter if the goals are, we want national greatness, we want industry, or we want agriculture. So industry, we're going to tax all kinds of people to promote the industrialization of the nation. Or we're going to tax all kinds of people so they lose in order to, so these people win, and we're going to promote agriculture. We're going to try, I mean, in the US, we've had all kinds of schemes. We're going to try to promote home ownership. We want everyone educated, so the government's going to take over the whole educational system. You can go on and on. You should have health care. So the government has a purpose that everyone should have some basic level of health care, or everyone should have Social Security. In all these, the government has goals and interests, and often it is, yeah, well, these goals and interests transcend the interests of individual citizens in the nation who are going to be penalized. Property will be taken away and given it to people who need health care, or property will be taken away from you because people need education. All that kind of view says that the government's job no longer is to just secure, and no longer is to secure the rights of the individual. So she thinks of so what is capitalism? Capitalism is a system in which each and every individual person's rights are secured and protected. And she thought in the 19th century, the American system came close to that. And in the late 19th century, because an obvious and dreadful, horrific exception is slavery. I mean, slavery pre-Civil War in America is there's millions and millions of individuals who are denied their rights completely. And that is not a capitalist system. So after the Civil War, and it's not even, I mean, part of what it means to say it comes close to that is the blacks after the Civil War, or the colored people as it would be put at the time, don't enjoy full rights. They don't enjoy anything close to full rights. But what this system is, what capitalism is only a system in which the government has one job, to protect individual rights, and it has no interest or goals of its own. And the whole of the 20th century is, no, government has interests and goals of its own that transcend the individual. And one of the, this is what Ben will talk about now, one of the deepest reasons for why government has to have all these goals, the issue of rights depends on viewing each individual as pursuing his own life. It's a right to life, his own self-interest, his own happiness. It's a right to his pursuit of happiness. As into the 19th century and certainly into the 20th century, the view is that is not a moral goal. The pursuit of your own self-interest and of your own happiness is not moral. And this is the sense in which government is about subordinating might to right. And if, oh, but what we're subordinated to is this principle of rights, but rights are inherently self-interested and selfish, and that's not right, that's wrong, that's evil, you need some other view of government, because now it no longer seems like you're subordinating might to right. And if what is good is the promotion of other people's goals, interests, welfare, it hands into government, it has to have the power to do all these kinds of things that serve the needy, serve the poor. And every, certainly in the US, every major new power that the government got in the 20th century that went well beyond the protecting of rights was justified by, well, but these people need these things. They need health care. They need a comfortable retirement. So we need Social Security. We need to take over the medical profession. And this is, government has this major goal that it has to try to achieve. And it just becomes, the more you think that, the more power gets handed to the state. And you get concentration of power in the state and out of the hands of the individual. And that kind of view is what she called that moral view. And the switch from the moral view that is embedded in the idea of rights is the concept of altruism. So let me stop there, and Ben will say it.
So Onkar, in light of the way you set things up, I'm not going to use my my usual slides. I'm going to do it a little differently than before, and some people here have already seen what I did before anyway. So I want to talk about, I'm going to start by talking about the alternative to the laissez-faire capitalist system that Onkar has just described, what it means in practice, and then why is it that people support it and oppose capitalism, connecting then to some of the moral topics. So whether you're talking about a fully socialist system or a more mixed economy like one of the welfare states in the modern West, what you're talking about is some form of wealth redistribution, either lots of it or moderate amounts of it, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And one thing I think and this came up a little bit in the Q&A at our last session, and so I was thinking about it, one thing that Ayn Rand said that was very distinctive about why she opposed all of these forms of wealth redistribution was that she thought there should be a separation between state and economy in just the same way and for just the same reasons as the separation of church and state. And so what was the reason? I think most people who support the idea of religious freedom or freedom of speech or other kinds of what are sometimes called social freedoms, they understand that abridgments of those freedom represent something that is a negation of the individual mind or soul. And I should say, I wasn't always an advocate of Ayn Rand's ideas. Earlier in my life, I leaned heavily toward the left, but I always considered myself to be some kind of liberal. In the United States, that means something a little different than what it means down here. It usually means leftist. But still in the United States, liberals tend to say they believe in free speech. So I always believed in free speech, freedom of association. But I didn't think that economic freedom was as important. And in Ayn Rand's view, abridgments of economic freedom are just as much of an offense against the freedom of the mind as are abridgments of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of association. And she sees no separation between what are sometimes called human rights and what everyone calls property rights. And there's lots of reasons for that, but her essential view is that the mind is the human means of survival, and the way that human beings live is by using their minds to manipulate matter and to adapt the environment to our needs. We don't adapt ourselves to the environment. And to be able to do that, we don't just need to have freedom within our own skull. We need to have the freedom to use our mind to manipulate matter. That's what property rights are essentially. And so when I read Atlas Shrugged for the first time, that's one of the things that's interesting about it is that it portrays the internal psychological life of business people, good ones and bad ones. But with the good ones, we learn that their pursuit of success in business is just as important and personal and a source of immense joy for them as is the creativity of an artist or the thought of a philosopher. And so she thought there's no separation between property and human rights, and I found that very compelling. And so I thought, well, if we need freedom of speech, we also need economic freedom, and for the same kind of reasons. So both socialism and the welfare state offend against the mind, then, to the extent that they want to expropriate your property. So why is it that people then support socialism or other forms of redistributionism? Well, part of it is that they make a separation there where Rand doesn't, and we could talk about why. But the deeper reason is, I think, what Onkar was hinting at toward the end of his presentation about that there's a moral viewpoint that leads people to oppose capitalism and to affirm socialism and its variants. And that's because, as I think he indicated, the freedoms that capitalism protects are egoistic, they're of egoistic, self-interested value. Your freedom is a personal, selfish value, especially because your use of your mind is a selfish, personal value. And not simply because you need your mind to create material wealth, and wealth is a selfish interest, but especially because you need your mind to discover the truth, and her view is that the truth is a personal, selfish value. So any person who wants to live in society, they can benefit from it tremendously through knowledge and trade and friendships, but the condition that someone's going to want for entering into a society is precisely the freedom to use their mind and to operate in the world with it. And she even thinks, and this is a corollary really, that the reason that we have for respecting the rights of other people is also a self-interested reason. If you want to benefit from other people's trade and knowledge and friendship, you need to leave their minds free so that they can produce the goods and the services and the other creative values that you want to benefit from as well. So capitalism it's the system of harmonious self-interest. And yet, people are opposed to self-interest. And that's the fundamental reason why they oppose capitalism and then affirm one form or another of redistributionism. So why do they oppose self-interest? Why then do they end up affirming the moral alternative, which Ayn Rand calls altruism? I'll say a word about each of those. First, self-interest, egoism, selfishness. In common parlance, when you call someone selfish or egoistic, you're saying it's because somebody, you think they pursue their own good to the exclusion of others or at the expense of others. We're asked to think that there's something important in common between somebody like Steve Jobs, who's created an amazing product that I'm reading my notes off of right now, and that millions of other people have benefited from as well. And he made a lot of money doing it. He made a lot of money through trade on a free market. He did something selfish. It benefited a lot of people by doing it, but it was in his self-interest. It's thought that there's an important commonality between him and someone like the Al Capone, who makes money by, in effect, killing people. And so the idea is, both of those people are acting in their interest. We don't want to be like Al Capone, so we shouldn't be selfish, even if that means that we were going to do it honestly through production, like someone like Steve Jobs. And so one point that Rand makes is that that is a package between Capone and Jobs that needs to be broken up, that these are fundamentally different kinds of people. It's true that they're both doing what they want to do, in some sense, but as Onkar pointed out, not everything that you want to do is necessarily good for you. If you take a hit of heroin and jump off of a building somewhere because you wanted to, this is not actually good for you. That's the simplest example. But there's many other things people can do to themselves that perhaps don't have as obvious of a consequence as that, which are still not very good for them. And when you live through theft and predation and killing and dishonesty, Rand's view is that has just as destructive effects on you and your mind and your self-esteem as taking the hit of heroin. Now, maybe it doesn't happen as quickly, but over the course of time, it's bad for you. And so her idea is that her philosophy is called objectivism, and she thinks that there is an objective value to self-interest. There are certain definite requirements of living a life of happiness, and one of the big requirements is using your own mind to live through your own production. So that precludes from genuine self-interest the life of the predator. And we could talk more if you have questions about what exactly that means, but she thinks that there's a virtue in selfishness. Not only is it virtuous, but it requires virtue. There are certain moral virtues one needs to cultivate in order to live that life of a successful producer in the long run. Honesty, integrity, justice, many others. We could talk about those. So the one point is that you've got to break up this unfair, superficial packaging between people who do what they want. Some of the things that people want are self-destructive. Some of the things that people want are productive. The truly self-interested, rational egoist is the one who pursues what he wants when it's something productive and creative and uses his rational mind. That's a common misunderstanding of self-interest. But then there's also a common misunderstanding of what it means to be altruistic. If there's a common understanding of that term, it's something like helping other people. But just like not everything you want is necessarily good for you, there are some differences in the things that are called helping other people. For starters, you can want to help certain other people in a way that is very much in your self-interest. If you're talking about helping out your close friends or your loved ones, the reason that they're your close friends or your loved ones in the first place is because they share important values and interests with you. And so you see their interests and you see their happiness as constituting part of your own happiness. And you're willing to help them, not as a sacrifice, but because you see it as paying the price to help them be happy, which makes you happy. Now, that's not true for anybody that you could help. Not if it's a complete stranger, not if it's an evil person, obviously. So one thing I think that's very clear is that you can help people, and it can be in your self-interest. And of course, since Rand advocates self-interest, she's very much in favor of helping and even sometimes taking risks for people that you love. But not all helping is that way. And so she says, again, you've got to break up the package between helping people who are of value to you and helping complete strangers or enemies. Now, it might be that in marginal cases, helping people who are strangers, but if you can do it through no sacrifice, if it's no cost, no reason not to do it. But if you're asked by someone like the philosopher Peter Singer to give up the bulk of your income, anything that you need to live beyond what he calls marginal utility, where you're not yet starving, he says, anything you don't need to starve yourself, give away to the people around the world who are starving. After all, they need it more than you do. Well, that's a lot of people. So that's altruism. That's what Rand opposes. Not the idea of helping people, but the idea of sacrificing your self-interest to other people. That is, giving up something that is a higher value to you to something that is a lower value. I think it's also important that when you really pay attention to what altruists are calling for, it's, even though they present themselves otherwise, what the philosophy really stands for is not some overriding concern with benefiting other people. That's part of the window dressing of the philosophy. But at the essence of it is really the idea, not that it's so good to help others, but that it's very good to deprive yourself. It really is the philosophy of sacrifice, of self-sacrifice. And that's self-sacrifice whether it's to God or to society or to the environment. And so the people who get the real moral credit in this kind of system are the ones who give something up, whether or not they benefit other people. And not only that, but they'll get moral credit even if they end up harming other people, as long as, well, they weren't getting any kind of self-interest out of it. And so this is part of the reason why in the modern West, communism has so much more moral respectability than, say, fascism. Even among people who are critics of communism, there's the idea that it's, even if it was a failed, a foolish effort, there's a sense that it was, people have a sense that it was well-intentioned. It was trying to help out the workers. It was trying to help out the proletariat. This is why, I don't know how it is down, it's probably different down here, but in the US, people walk around with Che Guevara shirts because it's cool. They would never walk around with a Hitler shirt. The same people would never do it. And yet, so you have societies like Cuba today and the Soviet Union where millions of people were slaughtered in the name of this system, but the leaders and the heroes of these revolutions are still regarded as idealists because, well, they were doing something for a cause thought to be greater than themselves. So altruism is not really about others at all, about helping or achieving the good of others. It's really about sacrificing oneself, not doing something out of self-interest. And so when you look at the results of socialist systems around the world, I think this is why they ended up leading to so much death and destruction. The systems demanded sacrifice from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Well, when you live consistently according to that philosophy, which is, I hope you can see at its core, an altruistic philosophy. If you want to be honest, if you want to be moral under this system, and you're someone with ability, you have to keep working until everyone else's needs without ability are met, and you'll find those needs multiply as this system becomes entrenched. And so the people who are actually trying to practice what they preach end up working themselves to death, and then there's no one left to redistribute from. So I'll just close by saying I hope I made a little clear why it was Ayn Rand thought that capitalism and individual rights depend on the idea of rational self-interest, and then why people oppose capitalism, because they oppose self-interest and they uphold altruism, but there are confusions behind the reasons for their political position there. And so what I think this adds up to, and this talk, this event today was called Philosophic Revolution, Ayn Rand's Philosophic Revolution case for capitalism. We've seen many revolutions over the last century, and they've mostly been political revolutions, but as one regime transitioned to another, the same basic moral premises were maintained. And people were asking earlier today, if the Maduro regime someday collapses in Venezuela, a person was worried, well, won't it just be another 10, 20 years before another dictator comes along? As has been the history of far too many countries in Latin America. And Onkar made the point, I think he's right, that the reason this happens is because people's basic moral premises don't change. The altruistic morality has been the traditional morality in the Judeo-Christian culture for millennia. And so if we want to stop the next dictator from coming back, whether it's in Venezuela or Argentina, or whether it's getting our first dictator in the United States, what we really need is in Ayn Rand's view, is a moral revolution where we are willing to challenge those moral premises, unpackage those artificial groupings in our minds about what self-interest means, about what altruism means, and fully affirm in a revolutionary way our right to live and to be happy. That's what we would need. So, thank you.
Para las preguntas, guys, I would need you to
and
then share one. I use one to.
I'll use mine.
Okay.
I'll sacrifice mine.
Yeah.
Okay, but we still need to share.
I hope it wasn't altruistic. Ok, ¿tienen preguntas? Les acerco el micrófono.
Hi. Here we have a really worse situation that you have in the United States. The people walking with the T-shirt of Che Guevara here is nearly tradition. How do you argue with these things? I go to the public university here in Buenos Aires, and it's the left is everywhere, and this argument of you hear a lot that if you defend freedom of speech, you are offending the other person, so you can't say what you think because you offend. How do you argue with these notions, and how do you argue with the fact that there is that moral is objective and not subjective? Because the left people say well, that's what you think, but I think otherwise.
So is this amplifying my voice? Is that okay?
Yes,
okay.
and also recording.
Yeah, and also recording. Where do you start? You start with facts and arguments, and you start with really knowing what your own views are. So why do you think what you think is good, and why do you think what you think is evil, and to learn to really articulate it. So if you're you think something right, there's something right about capitalism, something wrong about socialism. What really is the case for capitalism? Think that through and think what's the case against socialism? What is the history of socialism? What is the history of capitalism? Both are widely distorted, as you're noting. But so the first thing is to know the case for yourself and to be really convinced of it for yourself. And then you're asking, how do you talk to other people, argue with other people, and so on. You're not trying to change the mind of people really committed to their position. When we're talking about the level of they're committed communist or they're committed fascist, I mean, we have a rise of neo-Nazis in America. I don't think these positions are reached honestly, and you're not trying to convince them. You're trying to convince, in effect, a third party who thinks there's something to these ideas, and I can't really answer them, and there's something plausible about that. That's who you're trying to convince, that no, there's actually nothing plausible about these ideas, and the better case is for capitalism and for freedom of speech. And you have to be able to articulate to them what is right. So I'd never think of it like, how am I going to convince a communist? It's how am I going to convince the person who's seduced by communism and shouldn't be. And in regard to what we've been talking about, one of the major things is these movements cash in on moral ideas. So communism cashes in on various altruist ideas. And I mean, it's been quoted, I mean, the central, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Everybody thinks that's moral. Maybe it's not practical, and maybe if you had a whole system built on this, it doesn't really work. I don't know why it doesn't really work, but maybe it does. So maybe we shouldn't go all the way in regard to not communism, but just socialism. But it's clearly moral. And if you can't start to articulate for the person, well, what's moral about taking something that someone's made and giving it to someone precisely the basic criteria is that he didn't make it. That's what entitles him to the value. And why does a person lose the value? Precisely because he made it. And that's what you think is moral. You don't think something's morally wrong with that? And that's what you have to be able to do. And you're trying to win over the person who's innocently seduced by these wrong ideas, not the spokesman of these wrong ideas.
And so I'll just say a few quick things about what you might say to the more innocent person. So your first question was about the contention that speaking in a way that offends people is somehow violating their rights. And here it's important to go back to something that I was talking about. You know, what is it about freedom that is in one's rational self-interest? It's that you need freedom to use your mind in order to live. Well, but now that has implications for how we understand the idea of freedom of speech. The reason that we need freedom of speech is fundamentally because freedom of speech is a form of intellectual freedom. It's the way we communicate and exchange ideas from one another and learn by doing that. We learn both by hearing others' speech, but we also learn by giving our own speech and getting feedback from people, and even by speaking things that are sometimes mistaken because we say false things and then people correct us. So that's why we need freedom of speech. The reason is not because we have a need to feel comfortable all the time. In fact, learning difficult truths is something that we definitely sometimes need if we want to thrive and improve our minds. And so being uncomfortable is a requirement of life. It's certainly not, in certain cases, it's certainly not something that you have a right against. So all of these, the idea that there's something called hate speech, which the government could properly pass laws against, even though I maintain, that many of the people who are accused of hate speech are in fact saying hateful and awful things. That's something that should be and must be answered by more speech. You don't abridge anyone's freedom or violate anyone's freedom of speech by making them uncomfortable. The only thing that can actually abridge someone's freedom of speech or any other kind of freedom is the use of physical force, where you impose physical consequences on someone for some kind of action. So then your second question was about how can you say something about how values are objective, because they just say that's what you think. And this is a question you could ask about any number of topics that came up today, because they were saying freedom is an objective value and self-interest is an objective value. And there's a very long answer that we could give to this question. I'd recommend taking a look at the first chapter in this book, in The Virtue of Selfishness. The chapter is called The Objectivist Ethics. And so her philosophy is called objectivism. She thinks that there are objective values. She has a distinctive, unique conception of what that means. But what it means, in effect, is that there are facts of reality that are independent of anybody's beliefs or desires. And one of these facts is facts about the requirements of life. In Rand's view, it's the concept of, it's the fact of life that gives rise to the need and the possibility of talking about value concepts. There are certain things that are good for our life and certain things that are bad for our life. There are biological requirements of survival. And she has a broader conception of biology here than just stuff that you do in a test tube, because it includes things like we need to use our mind freely in order to survive. But that's something you still get through grand-scale scientific observations of history and abstracting philosophically from them.
Yes, may I ask a question first, and then I go with you? Because I want to continue with her question, which I think it's key in the Ayn Rand topic. How do we know that what we say is true? And in terms of your example, for example, right? Don't you see there's anything wrong morally there in taking from one to giving to the one who didn't produce, right? You produce, I'm taking that from you and give it. Okay, I think, because I read that book, that the idea of Rand, and Ben was explaining it, is to say, well, in nature, there's a requirement for survival, which is you need the freedom of your mind to pursue the goods that you need in order to survive. If we take a piece of that, we're going against your survival. So you're basing your truth, or Rand is basing her objective truth in nature. So the first question is, do you think she succeeded in this idea of actually having an objective truth because she went back to nature? And second question would be, is nature enough? I mean, nature changed, we have evolved. I mean, you can say that nature is the root for being anti-abortion, because in nature you can have an abortion or something like that, or you can have in vitro kids, you can have kids without having intercourse. But now it's different, and it's because people have technology. And I have a third one related to this, that in today's world, you have a multi-millionaire person, he perfectly survives, and he's paying a lot of taxes, but still he survives. And I think it's
wrong to take money from him, but I'm not convinced of the root of the truth that that's totally immoral, you know? Okay.
So I think part of what we're talking about here, we're putting it under the category of objective truth, but the narrower is objective values. So it's, can you say that something is actually valuable for someone even if they disagree? And I think the answer is yes. So our whole, as Ben was indicating, Rand's view is that values come from the phenomenon of life. And to give a simple portrayal of what that means, when you look at living things, you look at the plants you're growing in your house, you look at I live in a kind of semi-forested place. We have deer and foxes and raccoons in our backyard all the time. You have a perspective on all these things. Like, is it good for this plant? I've put it in a pretty dark place. Half of its leaves are fallen off. It's kind of no longer green, but a yellowish color. So is that good or bad for it? Is that valuable or harmful to it? We have in our backyard what we call a mangy fox. He looks like he can't catch anything. He looks like he's starving to death. Is that good for him or bad for him? On all living things, you have a perspective of what's valuable or harmful by looking at the fact that it's a living thing. It has to do certain things in order to stay alive and to thrive. So the plant is not dead. This mangy fox is not dead, but don't look at it and say, oh, this is a healthy fox. If you really saw it, this thing is, you can see its rib cage and so on. And this plant that's lost half its leaves and it's turning from green to yellow, you don't think, oh, this thing's thriving. It's not dead. So you have a perspective on it. It's a living thing. It has real requirements that it has to reach in order to live and thrive. And it can fully reach those. It can partially reach those. And the more it only partially reaches it, the closer it gets to death. And the more precarious its existence is, even when it's still alive. It's a lot like just a simple illness for this mangy fox will kill it. A healthy fox could get an illness and survive it. So it's closer to death. And Rand's view is there's no difference in kind. There's a radical difference in degree, but there's no difference in kind for an individual human being. You're a living thing. You have real requirements of what it means to thrive. And you can meet those fully, you can meet those partially, and you can be dead. And there's a lot of ways of meeting them only partially, that you're not really thriving, but you're not dead. And what morality is about thinking of all the conditions required for you really to thrive, and thinking especially of the fundamental, basic conditions that any and every person as an individual human being has to meet. And it includes proper functioning of one's mind, of acquiring knowledge and the right kinds of principles, of understanding the basic values that one should pursue in life. And she had a view that reason should be a value to you, that you should really prize the functioning of your mind and make sure that it's functioning fully properly. One of the things that she says often is you need to embrace reason, but that means your own reason as an absolute, and take it really, really seriously. And she thinks there's a bunch of things like this that are universal to human beings. And you establish that they're values by looking at nature and the nature of the living thing and what this living thing has to do to remain in reality, or to remain in existence, or to remain living. And And so that's, I mean, then there's a lot of detail to what she thinks morality is a complicated field. She thinks of it as a science. There's real investigation, real thinking of what these conditions are, what the principles you need to enact are, what the values you need to pursue are. But to take your example, now in the more political realm of, and this, I'll give it to you then, Ben, to deal with some of the other things if you want, of a millionaire paying taxes and so on. Yeah, she thinks in the end that the taxes and all kinds of government schemes and regulations are a violation of the right to property. And she thinks this makes life more precarious. It makes life harder for all the individuals, including for this millionaire. And if you compared it to if you lived in a capitalist system where there wasn't all this taking and violation of the right to property, the millionaire and everyone else who's trying to live would be thriving in a way that we are not today. And her perspective was not beware collectivism because you might descend into a gulag. You might. And this happened, and it happens a frightening amount that you have concentration camps and gulag. But that's not the reason to want capitalism, because I don't want to end up in the gulag. The reason to want capitalism is because it what enables you to thrive. Or if we had capitalism in the last 200 years versus what we have now, our standard of living would be undreamt of. I mean, really, in the way that in the people in the 17th century cannot conceive of our computers and projectors and so. What we would have if we had been free versus semi-free, you can't even imagine. You can't imagine what we would have had we been free, and that's the issue. So the fact that you don't fully achieve the values doesn't mean you're dead, but it means you're not thriving, and it's possible to thrive.
Yeah, I'll just say something really quick about the last part of your question about you mentioned changes in technology and what's the implication of that for making assessments of objective truth. Well, no special problem here. In fact, those aren't the problems, those are the solutions. What Onkar just talked about requirements of human life stem from the fact that there is such a thing as human nature, that we're born with certain nature and certain requirements. One fact about our nature is that we have a mind, and we use our mind to solve the problem of survival. And the main way that we do that is by creating new technology. So human beings have changed, obviously. They've developed, they've learned new things, they've created new technologies over the course of history. But human nature hasn't changed. It's in our nature to use our mind to create these new things, to live a better and better life. And what especially doesn't change is laws of cause and effect. That's what we need to discover. As we discover more of them, our life gets better. Ayn Rand would often cite the line from Francis Bacon, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. So what's being obeyed is basic laws of cause and effect once we discover them. But then once we discover them, we can begin to command nature to our ends. And I think that does it for them.
Okay. I have one question composed of two parts. The first one is the necessity for government. And the second, if you think that we actually need a government for, say, certain functions that no individual would take upon themselves, that you cannot rely on a private institution to fulfill. For example, defense in the era of nuclear weapons. If we more or less can agree that there can be a necessity for an organized government to tackle these issues, how do we fund that government? How do we fund that government without imposing taxes onto people or relying on great donations from millionaires who could use the power of such donations to steer the government in the direction that best benefits their own personal interests. I would like to stand on what you said about certain truths to be self-evident. For example, when you talked about health. Well, we impose onto private businesses that they should provide the nutritional information of the food produce they sell, right? And we also imposed regulations on activities like gambling. For example, you might have heard about the quite recent loot box issue. In video games for kids, they offered them a certain way of gambling through random items, right? So if we can agree more or less that kids gambling from a young age and is negative, and that it is necessary to know what you're putting into your body, how do we fund a government that is going to impose certain limitations on private businesses and private individuals, and do all of this in a moral manner?
Well, I'll start by saying something just about the nature and need of government. Maybe you can say more about the regulation issue. So it's definitely Ayn Rand's view that we should have a government. She is a critic of the anarchists, both of the leftist and rightist variety. Not only does she think we need one, but she thinks it's a necessary good. It's not a necessary evil. We've just talked a lot about the importance of individual rights. Government is what's necessary for the protection of individual rights. It's only if you have monopoly on the use of force, where everyone has to surrender their right to unilaterally retaliate against an aggressor, that you can have an organized society where people are free to live. So she's definitely in favor of government. And how do you fund it? She is actually opposed to funding it coercively, because that would offend against the very principle that that provided the foundation for the need of government in the first place. So she was, at the end of the day, she thought we should eliminate taxes. She thought it should be funded by some form or another of voluntary contribution. Now, it's an interesting question in legal philosophy how exactly that would work, and there have been different proposals, and she herself hypothesized the idea you could have a fee that you pay on contracts if both you and the other party want to have your contract arbitrated in a court of law. But I think you can give other ideas. There's other ideas too. I mean, one is simply that people give the money flat out. I think people give money even when they could free ride off a service in all kinds of situations. In the United States, we have public radio. And people can listen to that all they want, but still they call up and get the free tote bag and help fund the radio system. So you mentioned the problem, what if large benefactors contributed a lot? Well, I think that would be great. It would mean we certainly don't have a problem funding the government. Now, the worry that you have is that if the government institution is too dependent on the largesse of a certain small number of people, that would perhaps skew the objectivity of the system. And I mean, I think it's true about any human institution that there's no guarantee that it's going to be objective. Human beings have free will. They can choose to be objective or subjective. Governments are run by human beings. There's no magic spell that you can cast under any system that will stop it, that will make it incorruptible. So the problem to solve with government is not how can you guarantee that people are going to be objective and uninfluenced and uncorrupted. It's rather what kind of principles can you establish a system on? What kind of checks and balances can you infuse into it to at least make it the least probable kind of government to become corrupt. And I think that's what the American system came the closest to doing, especially toward the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. It was, of course, being funded through taxes, but I mean, taxation is its own source of corruption when the government can arbitrarily expropriate wealth from anyone it wants to, and then there's no upper limit as to the powers that it can acquire through that arbitrary means. So the solution isn't regarding any particular form of funding. It's, can you establish a system with separation of powers and checks and balances that end up protecting individual rights? And I think one of the cool things about the American system is that you have, and we talked about this last time, independent judiciary, but also an independent legislature and an executive, and each of them have separate interests, and the Constitution is arranged in such a way as to give them an interest in checking the other branches of government. And of course, to have that at the base, what you really need is a political philosophy that upholds the importance of individual rights. And of course, even that is something that can be abandoned, as is being done currently in the United States. But you need to have a deep cultural tradition that affirms that importance. And the citizens need to be resilient in their defense of it. And that's why I think it's Jefferson who says eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
On the other issue, it was about businesses providing information, such as about nutrition, and also about kids and gambling. So the kids and gambling, there's such a thing as an age of consent that should be embedded in the law. It's one of the functions of what government can do and should do in order to secure and protect rights. So a 5-year-old can't consent to things, and it's the parent's responsibility. And in that sense, so you can't have, I mean, I would ask the parent, if you got a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old who's in the casino at 1 a.m. gambling, like what are the parents doing is one. But two, if the casino said, oh yeah, well, we lent him $10,000 and he lost it all at the roulette, so now he's in debt to us. No, he can't consent to that kind of loan and that kind of business transaction. And that's an issue about rights, and trade means voluntary trade of two people of the capacity to understand what it is they're transacting. An agent of consent is a child at 5 doesn't have that capacity for that kind of understanding, and therefore for that kind of consent. But now if we're talking about information and nutritional information, things like this, and we're talking about it in an adult context, information is not free. So in the US, they've mandated that fast food chains put on their menus the calories of each meal. That's expensive to figure out what it is. And then whenever they change a dish, they have to, if they made some arrange, they have to figure out what the calories is of this new dish, and we've swapped this cheese for that cheese. What are the calories? And it's a complicated thing to really get that right. It's a cost. It requires action on the part of the restaurant and so on, and it gets put into prices. That, look, we had to figure all this thing out and so on. So, and the reason they do it for chains is they think a chain like McDonald's, Starbucks, and so on can absorb the cost. A mom and pop restaurant store, you might put them out of business if you require on your menu to put calories and so on. But so information is a value, it's a good, and it's for both the business and the consumer to figure out, is it worth it? Do I want to go to a restaurant in which every dish has its calories listed? It's an increased cost. I'm going to pay partly for this. Do I want to do that or not? And you should be free. So if for sure a restaurant should be free, look, for every dish, we put the calorie content on this. But another restaurant should be able to say, no, we don't. We're going to tell you what's in it. And it would be fraud if they say, well, it's such and such and such, and it's adulterated. And there's places where, for instance, for sushi restaurants, they list the fish as this, this, and this, and they do investigations. And, well, it's not tuna, and it's not. That's fraud, and that should be illegal as well. But that they don't list what the calorie content is, That should be a free decision of adults trying to figure out, is this information really valuable to me or not? And when it is, there's all kinds of private institutions, organizations that deal with what they sell as information. Like when I buy a computer, I don't look for a government stamp. Has it been approved by some government inspector and so on? But I do read magazines about that review computers and test the computers and see how fast they really are and so on. And they're providing information, but it's a cost, and you pay for that. And that should be, you should be free to decide if that is worth it to you or not.
Ok, son 8:30, tenemos tiempo para tal vez una pregunta rápida y concreta. ¿Hay alguna por ahí? Dale. Espera, ¿te paso esto?
During the seminar the other day, should I speak here? During the seminar the other day, you mentioned, when speaking about altruism, the example of Christ dying on the cross, and explaining through that for you it was a sin, because in a way he was dying for somebody else's sins. And how does Christianism, or in general people defending altruism, trying to justify that act? What is the reason why they explain that's a valuable way to behave?
I don't think it's an issue of trying to explain it in some other kind of way. It's presented exactly as what it is. It's presented as you have Jesus Christ, who's supposed to be the embodiment of moral perfection. He's your moral exemplar. He's the good. And what is the proof that he's good? That he throws his life away in a incredibly painful way. It's him suffering on the cross, crucified. For what? For good people? No. For sinners. It is, he gains nothing and gives everything. For the sake not of loved ones, not even of strangers, but it's the equivalent of when he preaches, love thy enemy. It's for people who you view as they're bad and here bad means morally bad, morally corrupt. That's how it's presented. And it's presented as this is what makes him the ideal. And there's not some further explanation of it. This is part of, like, do you accept this? Is this really what's good? The good is for the good to throw their life away for the sake of sinners. But that's the whole message of Christ on the cross. And it doesn't have some kind of further explanation. It's, this is what our conception of what morality looks like. And Ben brought up a point, and religion is very good for figuring this out, for seeing this, that this is the essence of altruism. What Christ is about is sacrifice and self-sacrifice, and not for the sake of anything else. And the whole religious viewpoint that you're supposed to give up things for the sake of God. What does God need you to sacrifice for? He's all-knowing, all-powerful, perfect, self-contained. What does he gain? Nothing. He gains nothing. All that happens is you lose. And that's part of why altruism, it's the essence, is self-sacrifice. There's nothing for God to gain. He doesn't need anything. He's perfect. All it is about is you losing. And that's part of the imagery on the cross as well. So I don't think there's any kind of further explanation. This is the essence of the view. And the question is, do you accept this or not? And there's a lot of social pressure. Well, everybody else accepts this, so I guess I should too. And part of what makes Rand a moral revolutionary is to say, this is monstrous. And I don't care how many people accept it, it's monstrous. And I think she's right about that.
And there's an essay she wrote called Faith and Force, Destroyers of the Modern World. And I don't remember the exact line, but it's something to the following effect. Why, she asked the question, why should one sacrifice as the altruists demand? And she says, no earthly reason has ever been given. It's always been, in other words, it's always been some kind of mystical reason. So the reason that you're expected to believe that morality consists in sacrifice is well, there isn't one. You're expected to take it on faith. And there's a very interesting question then, why it is that the people who propose the idea that you're to take it on faith so desperately want you to believe it. And there's an easier and a harder answer to that question, I think, in her view. I mean, the easier perspective is, well, if you're sacrificing, there's always going to be someone to collect the sacrifices. But that's not the end of the story, because it's not her view that those who demand sacrifices are actually selfish and wanting to benefit from what it is that you're giving them. She thinks that they're much worse than that. And so she has a deeper view that suggests when they see that they've succeeded in convincing you to accept their say-so on faith, what you're really helping them to do in that case is you're helping them to pretend in something. You're helping them to pretend that they have self-esteem, for instance. You're helping them to fake the fact that they're in control of the world. They think that when they're able to make you believe what they want you to believe, that they have some kind of omniscient power over reality, which is something that they want to believe only because they are not themselves trying to go the route of Francis Bacon. They're not themselves trying to command nature by obeying its facts. They're inverting nature and human consciousness and expecting that they can command nature simply by wishing it so. And she thinks that's the opposite of a proper perspective on reality. This is something that she goes into some depth about later in a lengthy speech toward the end of Atlas Shrugged. Learn more about that if you don't skip the speech. So don't do that.